I'm Jim Cuno, president of the J. Paul Getty Trust. Welcome to Art and Ideas, a podcast in which I speak to artists, conservators, authors, and scholars about their work.
I would not say that Vasari invented the Renaissance, but I would say that he probably invented art history.
In this episode, I speak with Getty Museum paintings curator Davide Gasparotto about the lives of three Renaissance artists, Giovanni Bellini, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Giorgio Vasari, although a Florentine painter of great distinction, is perhaps best known today for his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects from Cimabue to Our Times, first published in 1550. Vasari's lives, as they are called, are rightly considered the foundation of art historical writing. Even today one reads them for pleasure and edification, and no course in Renaissance art is complete without them. I recently sat down with Davide Gasparotto, senior curator of paintings at the Getty Museum, to discuss three of Vasari's lives, those of Italian artists Giovanni Bellini, Raphael, and Michelangelo. These writings have recently been published by Getty Publications in a new series of biographies called Lives of the Artists, which extends far beyond the Renaissance. Over the next few months, I will be talking with Getty Museum curators about different lives in the series, including those of Rembrandt, Rodin, Manet, Van Gogh, and more. But we begin where we should, with Vasari's lives of Bellini, Raphael, and Michelangelo. Davide, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. The lives were published first in the first edition in 1550. I'm interested in the circumstances of their publication. Were they published under the patronage of a particular person, the Medici, for example? And were they an instant success, or how long did it take before they became success?
I think they were a big success. As you said, they were published in 1550. They were published all at once. There was a publisher that was from Florence, Lorenzo Torrentino. That's why we call this edition, the first edition, the Torrentiniana in Italian, the Torrentinian edition. And there were 2 volumes with 128 lives. And they were all lives of dead artists which were already
except Michelangelo.
Dead. The only living artist which was included is Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And Vasari started very early on to be interested in collecting materials about artists. But he really started more seriously during the 1540s when he was working in Rome. And he was working for a very important patron at the time, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who was the nephew of the Pope of the moment, Paul III. And in the circle of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, Vasari met an historian, Paolo Giovio, who encouraged Vasari in this enterprise of collecting information about artists and this idea of publishing a series of biographies.
Can I ask you what kind of information he collected? How did he collect it, from whom, or in what format did he collect them?
He collected information from previous literary sources. He collected information from artists themselves, and in his many travels, he saw many works of art in churches, and so he had several type of sources, and so he was encouraged by these Farnese circles, and at the end he was able to publish the lives in 1550, and he decided to dedicate the lives to the Duke of Florence, Cosimo I de' Medici, even if at the time he was not employed by the Medici. And so it was a sort of an act that he did because he wanted to gain the support and friendship of the Duke. And in fact, he succeeded because in 1554, 4 years after the publication of the Lives, he was basically hired by Cosimo de' Medici as a court artist, and he became, for the following 20 years, the main I would say, court artist of Cosimo I de' Medici.
So when these were published, were there booksellers at the time? What was the size of the edition? Do we know that there were hundreds? Or?
Yeah, I think there were hundreds. And we know that it was a success because soon afterward, Vasari started to think to a second edition of the Lives. So he continued to collect information. He did other important trips. Vasari was widely traveled. After his sort of training in Florence, he traveled a lot until the 1550s when he was more based in Florence, but he traveled a lot. He lived in Rome, he worked in Naples, he worked in northern Italy, and especially after the publication of the first edition, when he started to think to a second edition of the Lives, he traveled twice in Italy, in central Italy and in northern Italy, especially in Lombardy and in Venice, to collect information. And in the second edition of the Lives, he greatly enlarged the number of the biographies. He included also other living artists, so not only Michelangelo. And he also included a very important feature, which was really influential even later on. He included portraits of the artists themselves that were engraved were xylographies, so woodcuts. And also for the portraits, he had to collect a lot of information to get portraits, real portraits of the artists. Obviously, for the artists of the first period, the 14th century, because he starts with Cimabue, so he starts with the life of a painter who lived in the late 13th century. The portraits are mostly invented or made up, but the feature of the portraits is very important, I think.
Yeah. So you said that there were precedents before the 1550 edition, models for him to use, but there were also antique precedents,
yes,
like Plutarch's biographies of the notable lives of the Romans, yes, and Greeks. Did he know of Plutarch, and was Plutarch well known at the time?
Yeah. I think, Vasari was very well educated. He was born in Arezzo, in 1511. There was a humanist that was very influential, humanist from Arezzo, Giovanni Pollastra, who was very influential in his education. So he was pretty literate as an artist. He knew for sure the classical models, the models of the classical antique biography. I'm sure he knew about Plutarch, the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans, but probably he knew also the lives of the philosophers by Diogenes Laertius. He obviously knew the widespread models for the biographies of the rulers, the Roman emperors, Suetonius. So he knew the classical precedents, and he knew also about sort of the revival of the biographical genre, which took place already in the 15th century, and especially for military men or rulers. But also there is an important precedent that we know that Vasari knew, that was the life of Filippo Brunelleschi, the great Florentine architect of the early 15th century, which was published by a humanist, a Florentine humanist, Antonio Manetti. And Vasari knew for sure this source.
Davide, give us an idea of how the lives are organized.
The lives of Vasari, there is this biographical model behind them, but the structure of the book is more complex, and it's a very interesting structure because we don't have only a series of biographies of artists from Cimabue, late 13th century, to Vasari's own time, so to Michelangelo, who was still living, but also there is a very important preface, which is called Proemio, to the lives, where in some way Vasari's set up the stage with a more theoretical introduction. And then there are technical introductions to the three arts, architecture, sculpture, and painting. And then Vasari divided up the biographies in three main periods. So he sort of reconstructs the history of art from the early 14th century to his own time, dividing up in three moments, which for him represent three moments of progress in the arts. And the first moment corresponds roughly to the 14th century, so from Giotto to the end of the 14th century. Giotto is the great renewer of the arts. Then the second period starts at the beginning of the 15th century with, again, a great moment of change in the arts with the artists such as Masaccio, Donatello, and Brunelleschi. And it's the period that now we call the early Renaissance. And then the third great moment for Vasari is the moment represented by artists such as Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, Titian, which he defines as the maniera moderna, the modern manner, is the art of his own time. And in these three periods, he sees an evolution, a progress in the arts. He obviously, for Vasari, the progress in the arts is represented by more naturalism, the ability of the artist to capture the truth of nature. And so behind this incredible architecture, complex architecture of the book, there is a classical source also, which is Pliny the Elder's Natural History, where Pliny, in the 1st century after Christ, describes in three books of the natural history, the books from 34 to 36 of the natural history, he describes the evolution of the art in antiquity, starting from, the Greeks and going to the Romans. And he sees this evolution as a sort of a biological evolution, where there is a birth, there is a growth, a maturity, when the art attains a sort of a perfection, and then there is an old age. So there is a period of decadence. And this biological model is the model that is behind also the structure of Vasari's life in some way. And so his evolution starts with Giotto, with his sort of the birth. Then there is a progress, which is represented by Masaccio, Donatello, and Brunelleschi. And then there is an acme, there is a peak, which is represented by the art of his own time, and especially by Michelangelo.
Okay, so there's clearly a structure to the book that he published in 1550 in 2 volumes, and it was based on classical sources. There was also an intellectual debate at the time over the values between Florentine painting and Venetian painting. He championed the Florentine, the intellectual and analytical, over the natural that was identified as the Venetian style. He championed the disegno over the colore being the color that was championed by Venice. There was also some alternative writer who was championing Venice over Florence, and that was Pietro Arantino. Tell us more about that debate, and tell us what Vasari knew about Arantino's writing and championing of Venetian painting.
Yes. First of all, we have to say that really the cornerstone of Vasari's conception of art was the concept and the role of disegno or drawing. But disegno in Italian is, especially in this moment, in the 16th century, is not only drawing, the physical act of draw, but is also, we have to understand it also with the modern concept in some way of design. So with stressing the importance of the invenzione, as in Italian, of the invention. So the ability to draw was also the ability to invent, to conceive complex compositions. And disegno is the theoretical foundation of Vasari's vision of art. And this is also why Michelangelo is so important for him, because Michelangelo in some way encompasses in his own personality and his own artistic activity the three concepts together, because he was able to draw, and so he was at the same time an architect, a painter, and a sculptor. In comparison to Florence, the situation in Venice is different because disegno, drawing in Venice, was not as important as in Florence in training. We don't want to say that in Venice the artists were not able to draw, because we have drawings by major Venetian artists of the 16th century like Titian and Pordenone and Lorenzo Lotto, but sometimes artists just sketched and they directly draw into the canvas, and then the color was more important. And so Pietro Aretino was from Arezzo, like Vasari, so they knew each other. They were friends, actually, because when Vasari went to Venice in 1541, he went to Venice because Aretino summoned him to Venice to paint the scenes, the scenography for one of his plays, L'Atalanta. And what the Florentines were stressing is that their ability to draw was also the ability, for example, to create very convincing foreshortening of the figures, so all the tricks that are associated with a good draftsmanship. While the emphasis in Venice was more colore, was more color. But this was a debate that lasted for the entire century, and we know that Vasari's position is probably the same position of Michelangelo, for whom also drawing was sort of the foundation of art, because when Titian, the great Venetian painter, went to Rome in 1545, invited from the Pope, Paul III, he painted this famous painting, the Danae, and Michelangelo saw this painting by Titian, and Vasari reports that Michelangelo said that if Titian would have been such a good draftsman as he was a good painter, he would have been the greatest of the possible artists. But for Michelangelo, Titian lacked in some way in drawing ability. And so there was really this competition, and obviously writers from Venice always praised the Venetian capacity to evoke atmosphere, to evoke nature, and to evoke the sensuality in some way of the human figure and nature through color. And the Florentine were stressing more the importance of a correct, in some way, draftsmanship.
Okay, we'll get to Venetian paintings soon, but let's start with Florentine painting. We have 3 lives to look at. 2 of the lives are Florentine painters, Raphael and Michelangelo, and the 3rd life is Giovanni Bellini, a Venetian painter. But so let's start with Raphael. Tell us about Raphael's career, and tell us how Vasari characterized Raphael's career. How did he place Raphael in the pantheon of painters?
Mm-hmm. We already said that Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo were, for Vasari, the greatest painter of his own time. They were the opener of the modern manner, of the maniera moderna. And in particular, Raphael represented for Vasari a very, very important model for his own, in some way, career. So his image of Raphael is extremely positive. He obviously praised Raphael as a painter, as an architect, as, especially in the phase of Raphael's career when Raphael was in Rome, as a great expert of antiquities. And he praised also Raphael's good manners and his sort of being a perfect courtier, we can say. And this, in some way, in comparison to the more rough and less sociable character of Michelangelo. But for Vasari, Raphael represented a very important model, especially in the late phase of Raphael's career, when Raphael was working in Rome, at the beginning for Pope Julius II and then for Pope Leo X. Raphael managed a large workshop, and he was able to undertake very complex projects all at the same time. So he managed to paint in the famous Stanze in the Vatican. He managed to provide the drawings for the famous tapestries for the Sistine Chapels with the Acts of the Apostles. He was able to paint altarpieces. He was able to paint in the villa of Agostino Chigi, the famous Farnesina, where Raphael painted some frescoes. And he was able to plan the famous study of the ruins of Rome under the patronage of Pope Leo X. So he was really able to manage a workshop where he was sort of providing his assistants and his pupils with his ideas, with his drawings, but then he was executing few of these works, and he was sort of assigning the different tasks of really executing the works of art themselves to his pupils. So Vasari admired hugely and deeply this sort of entrepreneurial quality of Raphael, because in some way he was seeing these as something that he was aspiring to be. And it was actually what later on Vasari became. Vasari became the great entrepreneur, the great impresario, the great director of all the artistic endeavors for Cosimo I, the Duke of Florence.
And this is something that Michelangelo didn't do. He didn't pursue a big workshop like that. So how did they hold in tension the qualities of Raphael and the qualities of Michelangelo at the time? How was it that someone could be valued as a great entrepreneur and a great manager of a workshop, or on the other hand, a great individual genius like Michelangelo?
Yeah, I think, it's, with this, we don't have to say that Raphael was not a great individual genius. He was a great individual genius. His autograph works of art are of an unparalleled quality. They are unbelievably accomplished. I think that for Vasari, in some way, Raphael represented a type of courtier artist that he was aspiring to be. He was also representing a type of artist, I would say, profoundly different from Michelangelo, in the sense that Raphael was a great assimilator. Raphael was a painter who was able to absorb from other artists an important lesson and to make a new step in his own career. So in this respect, Raphael is a little bit like Giovanni Bellini. He was absorbing the lesson at the beginning of Perugino, then of what was happening in Florence with Leonardo and Michelangelo himself, and then later on also he was looking at Michelangelo and, absorbed the lesson of these artists and making his own in a new way.
When we look at the paintings by Raphael that Vasari singles out as examples of the greatness of the painter, are there any surprises? That is, do we today value the very same paintings that Vasari valued of Raphael's, or are there some that we value more than Vasari did? I'm trying to get a sense of how strong and lasting the canon is and what role Vasari played in establishing the canon of Raphael's paintings.
Yeah, I think that Vasari sort of praises the same paintings we praise today. Some of the great Madonnas by Raphael painted in the Florentine period, obviously the Vatican stanze, and the Madonna Sistina, for example, one of the greatest altarpieces by Raphael, or the Transfiguration, the last important project by Raphael. Probably what modern research did is to look more deeply into the collaborative aspects in Raphael's workshop. So what in certain projects, which is the extent, I would say, in certain projects of the role of the collaborators, of the workshop's assistant of Raphael. But for example, the tapestries, the great endeavor of the tapestries was highly praised by Vasari and is still something we admire a lot. So I think Vasari covers a great deal of the production of Raphael, and for us, the works that were important for him are still important for us. The same we can say for Michelangelo. Probably Vasari was not sort of an admirer of Michelangelo's character and his sort of solitary attitude was remote from Vasari's mentality and attitude. But he was obviously admiring enormously Michelangelo because of his achievements as an artist. And we have to say that, Michelangelo is a completely different artist than Raphael. Raphael was a genius that was able to absorb from the others and make the lesson of the others his own. Michelangelo is a sort of a Minerva that comes out from the head of Jupiter already fully formed, and his obsessions, his figurative obsessions, they start since he is young and they go along throughout his whole life. And his great obsession, as we know, was the representation of the human body. And so Michelangelo's career is all a sort of a meditation, a going back and forth, and it turns all around the representation of the human body, So it's a more monolithical than Raphael. And I think Vasari was sort of aware of this.
I want to give our listeners a taste of the sort of style of Vasari as a writer, and it's easy to look at the life of Raphael for this. So he said of Raphael, he said, "Heaven endowed him with the power of showing a disposition quite contrary to that of most painters. For the artists who worked with Raphael, not only the poor ones, but those who aspired to be great, and there are many such in our profession, lived united in harmony, all their evil humors disappearing when they saw him, and every vile and base thought deserting their mind. He was so full of kindness that even animals liked him." Is that a particular rhetorical device that he's using there? The kind of telling about how nice a man he was and how people loved him, and even animals loved him. Is he relying on prior rhetorical examples for that?
I think, I think that obviously there is a rhetorical device here. And we know today that Vasari also himself was sort of relying on more experienced writer and literati for his own, language, for his own drafts of the lives. So there is obviously a rhetorical device here, but we have to say that there are many sources prior to Vasari that emphasize the good character of Raphael, his kindness, his openness. And so I think there is a truth behind this sort of vision of Raphael as a very nice man, or very sociable person. He was very good in dealing with his patrons and with his clients. On the other side, we have to say that Vasari, both in Raphael's life and Michelangelo's lives, in some way doesn't tell all the truth about, for example, the relationship between the two artists. Because we know that for sure Raphael admired Michelangelo, and he even portrayed him as an homage in the famous fresco in the Stanze Vaticane, the School of Athens, where he portrays Michelangelo as an ancient philosopher. But we know also that there was a fierce, strong competition between them when they were in Rome. So when Michelangelo was painting the Sistine ceiling and Raphael was painting the Stanze, Raphael was strongly protected by Bramante, the famous architect, the architect of the new Basilica of St. Peter. But the two, there was no sympathy, there was no friendship between them. And actually there was a strong competition. And in some way, at some point, Michelangelo used in some way against Raphael another painter, Sebastiano del Piombo, the Venetian painter who came to work in Rome, and he provided Sebastiano with drawings for paintings that were executed as a sort of in competition with Raphael. There is a famous case which is also retold by Vasari in Raphael's life, that when Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, the nephew of Pope Leo X, commissioned to Raphael and Sebastiano del Piombo two paintings, and the Transfiguration and the Resurrection of Lazarus, and obviously Sebastiano was helped by Michelangelo, who provided him with some drawings, because Michelangelo really wanted Sebastiano to sort of triumph against Raphael. So the relationship between the two artists were really very competitive.
You've already said that Michelangelo was the only artist in the lives who was living at the time the first edition came out.
Yes.
And so what did it mean, or how influential was it upon Vasari that Michelangelo, the man he was writing about, was actually alive and would be reading what he wrote?
Yes, we have to remember that there was an enormous aura surrounding Michelangelo when he was still living. In 1532, for the first time, he is labeled as divine by the famous poet Ludovico Ariosto in his Orlando Furioso. So, already in 1532, Michelangelo was divine, as he was later on in Vasari's life. Obviously, it was not easy to write about Michelangelo living, and we actually know that Michelangelo was not happy with Vasari's life, because he was still, he read obviously immediately the lives and his own life. He was not happy because, for example, Vasari writes in Michelangelo's life that Michelangelo was apprenticed to Domenico Ghirlandaio, the famous Florentine painter, when he was young. And basically Michelangelo commissioned in some way to one of his pupils and friend, Ascanio Condivi, a biography of himself, a biography which came out 3 years after Vasari's life in 1553.
To correct
what Michelangelo thought to be mistakes in Vasari's life. And for example, in Condivi, there is a sort of a denial of the fact that Michelangelo was a pupil of Ghirlandaio. Instead, he said that Michelangelo, as a very young boy, was discovered by Lorenzo il Magnifico, and then Lorenzo the Magnificent hosted him in his famous garden of San Marco, where he was looking at an antique sculpture, where he was working with the house sculpture of Lorenzo il Magnifico Bertoldo. And so Condivi hides the training of Michelangelo, but obviously this was something made up, because we know that Vasari was right. And in fact, it's very interesting, in the 1568 edition of the life of Michelangelo, Vasari produces a document that attests the fact that Michelangelo was in fact in the workshop of Ghirlandaio, was working in the workshop of Ghirlandaio. And he found this document in these famous researches, and it's really an archival document. So it's one of the first cases in art history, I think, of the use of an archival document to prove something. And so it's interesting that Michelangelo was not really totally happy with Vasari's life of himself.
Now let's get to Bellini, so we can get to a Venetian painter. You edited this book on Bellini, and so you know intimately about the life of Bellini and how it's cast by Vasari. How many Venetian painters are included in the lives that Vasari wrote, and why did you choose Bellini?
So yes, we have to say that there are several Venetian artists in Vasari's lives. There are more Venetian artists in the second edition of the Lives, the one published in 1568. But obviously, Bellini, actually, we have to say the Bellini, because the life of Bellini is not just the life of Giovanni Bellini, but it's a sort of a collective life of members of the Bellini family, because the Bellinis were a family of artists. The father of Giovanni Jacopo was the most important Venetian artist of the early 15th century, and then he had two sons. One was Giovanni, the other one was Gentile, and so the life is a sort of a collective life. And obviously Vasari chose the Bellini because they were the most important family of artists working in Venice in the 15th century, and in particular Giovanni was widely considered the greatest Venetian painter of the second half of the 15th century. And so it was natural to include a life of the Bellini in his own book. But obviously when it comes to information, the lives of, I would say, northern Italian painters by Vasari are very important for us today, but they are obviously less precise than the lives of Florentine or, I would say, of central Italian painters. Vasari was collecting information, but I think he was more successful with lives, especially of Florentine painters. So sometimes there are, things that then are wrong, or sometimes there is chronologies messed up. So they are important lives, a great source for the reconstruction of the career of these artists, but they are in some way less precise, even if Vasari traveled several times to Venice and he knew the works, the paintings, he collected information.
In this case, in this book that you've edited from the life of Bellini, you include two other lives, not by Vasari, but by Carlo Ridolfi and Marco Boschini, 17th century authors.
Mm-hmm. Carlo Ridolfi was a painter, and Marco Boschini also was a painter, but also an engraver and a dealer also in paintings.
So how differently did they see Bellini 100 years after or 50 years after Vasari saw him?
We should say, first of all, that Vasari represented a very important model for later biographers. So the lives, they really became a model. So many lives of artists published in the 17th century, like the lives published by Giovanni Pietro Bellori, or the lives of the Bolognese painters by Carlo Cesare Malvasia, the lives of Florentine artists by Baldinucci, all lives published in the 17th century were very much influenced by Vasari. Even books and artist biographies published in Northern Europe were strongly influenced by Vasari. As early as 1572, a Northern humanist, Domenicus Lampson, published a sort of a series of biographies of Flemish artists, and then later on in 1604, Karel van Mander published a series of biographies of Northern artists.
Was this in part because it was good business now?
I think so.
Because sort of established a trade
because there was an interest. There was an interest also in publishing books on artists from other places than Florence. And obviously there were collectors, there were amateurs, which were interested in this kind of books. And actually Ridolfi, for example, these lives that he published of Venetian painters were a sort of a Venetian response to Vasari, sort of 1 century later, to praise many Venetian artists that, in the opinion of Ridolfi, were not too much praised or too much admired by Vasari. And the biography of Ridolfi is important because there are a lot of information, especially about paintings by Bellini, which at the time were in private hands, because Ridolfi knew a lot about the collections in Venice. So he mentions a lot of paintings which at the time were in private hands.
And which Vasari wouldn't have seen?
Which Vasari didn't know. So it's a good source of information. While Boschini, I think Marco Boschini is a very different case because Ridolfi is more factual. He gives us some dates, in some way, informations. But Boschini is different. The book of Boschini is not a collection of biographies. It's a poem. It's written in Venetian dialect. It's a poem on painting. It's called Carta del Navegar Pittoresco, which we can translate as Map of Pictorial Navigation. And it's a sort of a history of Venetian painting in verse. And it's a fascinating book. It's beautifully written. And what characterizes Boschini is that Boschini is not so interested in the precision of description or saying where the paintings are or in analytical information, but he is interested in capturing the aura, it's capturing the style, it's capturing the characters of the different artists. So his characterization of Bellini is profoundly sympathetic. Is very beautiful the way in which he captures, for example, Bellini's attention to nature and his religious subjects. And so I think it's a sort of a different category of critical appraisal of the artist.
You also include in your edition of the life of Bellini a correspondence with the great patron of the arts from Mantua, Isabella d'Este. These are letters written by and about Bellini and the paintings that she commissioned from him. How important is that correspondence, and And what does it add to the life of Bellini that Vasari wrote?
I think the correspondence with Isabella d'Este, it's a fascinating document because, first of all, it adds in some way the personal voice of the artist. The artist was still living. This correspondence involves him directly, and it's rare to have such a precise correspondence between a patron and an artist and some intermediaries, because in this case there are also some intermediaries, some agents of Isabella who were in Venice, and they are sort of writing back and forth with the Marchioness to inform her about the progress of the commission. And sometimes we really sort of hear the voice of Bellini himself. And there is a particular passage I really sort of love, and I think it's very important in this correspondence, and it is when the great poet Pietro Bembo, who was a friend of Isabella but also a friend of Bellini, he writes to Isabella about the painting that she wanted to commission from Bellini, and she wanted one of these elaborate allegories that she was fond of. And Bembo writes to Isabella, "I have been with Bellini recently, and he is very well disposed to serve your excellency as soon as the measurements of the canvas are sent to him. But the invention which you tell me I am to find for his drawing must be adapted to the fantasy of the painter. He does not like to be given many written details which cramp his style. His way of working, as he says, is always to wander at will in his pictures, so that they can give satisfaction to himself as well as to the beholder." So it's very interesting because I think this is probably one of the first really statement about artistic freedom in some way in the history of art, because the painter is saying that he doesn't want too many stipulations to limit his fantasy, his style. He wants to paint. He wants, as he says, to wander at will in paintings. So it's like that here we are hearing the direct voice of Bellini, hearing one of his conversations with Pietro Bembo, the great poet. So I think the value of this correspondence is really great because we are witnessing a real conversation between the painter and the patron.
Yeah. So we gathered this afternoon to talk about the lives as written by Vasari, the lives of the artists. The art historian Pat Rubin begins her important book on Vasari with the bold statement that Giorgio Vasari invented Renaissance art. What do you think of that?
I don't think really that Vasari invented Renaissance art. I think since I would say we find the concept of Renaissance, or at least the idea that at some point art was rebirthed, that there was a new flowering of art, we found this concept in earlier sources than Vasari. I think that we already found this concept in early 15th century sources like the autobiography of the great Florentine sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti. And we find this concept in the book on painting published in 1535 by Leon Battista Alberti, the great architect. So the idea that there was a new beginning is already present in earlier sources than Vasari. But I think that what really Vasari did, he invented art history, because his biographies are the first history of art. You know, we saw based also on antique, on classical precedents, but they are really the first history of art, where one person, sort of one writer, examines the development of the art in a certain period. He examines the individual styles of the artist. He examines their careers, their achievement, their works. He describes their works. So I think that I would not say that Vasari invented the Renaissance, but I would say that he probably invented art history.
Davide, thank you for your time this afternoon on the podcast, and thank you for your contribution to this book project that we have here at the Getty of looking at the lives of artists. These three, as written by Vasari, but then other artists' lives written by other art historians later. They're beautifully produced, not only in the quality of reproductions that are included in them, but in the size and scale of the books, so that you can stick them in your pocket and take a train to Florence as you seek to look at the work of Raphael, Michelangelo, or go to Venice and see the work of Giovanni Bellini. So thank you so much for what you've done for this project, and thank you for time on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Jim. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Our theme music comes from the Dharma at Big Sur, composed by John Adams for the opening of the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles in 2003. It is licensed with permission from Hendon Music. Look for new episodes of Art and Ideas every other Wednesday. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Play Music. For photos, transcripts, and other resources, visit getty.edu/podcasts. Thanks for listening.